Well, when I was a graduate student many years ago, um, it was said that there was no such thing as the Dark Ages, and I think that's probably where history, professional history, is these days. I think if you had lived at that time, you would have said, "Yeah, there's the Dark Ages." Um, it's a period of time when we actually don't have a lot of information on. It had rough parallels in between China and Western Europe, and it was in many ways the foundation of European civilization. But I don't think it was a whole lot of fun to live at that time. Um, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I want to show you the dynasties and talk about some parallels of China. The Dynasty, which ends in 220, or about exactly the same time that the Roman Empire starts to crack up internally. The Han Dynasty, which had been a very powerful dynasty, nevertheless comes to an end. And we have this period, and again, it's roughly parallel to the period of chaos inside Rome, the crisis of the third century. We have what's known as the period of the Three Kingdoms, which were a period of immense instability within China. Then we get the Jin Dynasty from 260 to 420, which again roughly parallels, this is by 24 years, the period in which Diocletian and Constantine reestablished the Roman Empire. Now, the 420, the Jin Dynasty comes in, and again, just like Rome, it splinters into pieces. Now, Rome began to splinter around 405, 406. And again, it's not exact, but it's close. And the period of the darkest period of the Middle Age, if I'm allowed to use that phrase, uh, in Western Europe was during this period of splintering in China. Now, China is reunited in 589. uh, Europe is going to have to wait until the late 700s or 800, if you prefer Christmas Day, 800 perhaps, when Charlemagne is crowned. But nevertheless, China is reunited in 589 and goes to 755, where it splinters again. So we're a little bit out of sync here because the splintering of Europe won't begin again until about 814. But what you have here are a lot of things that are very common. Then, again, another really dark period in the both China and the Western Europe is the period from around 900 to the middle part of 960. Again, that's about the time that an empire, what we call the Holy Roman Empire, which is incorrect. It was the Germanic Empire. Is founded at almost exactly the same time, 960, with the Sung Dynasty. Um, Almost all of these are accompanied by breakdowns in public health. Certainly, many of these periods where things go apart uh, appear to be associated with smallpox and measles entering into China, usually far enough apart that the immunity of the people were off. Was there a bubonic plague in China? I suspect very strongly that there was a bubonic plague in China, and I think most scholars do too. Um, there's a lot of, unlike Western Europe, there's a lot of documentation in China. It's just that it's hard to get at. And the Chinese, they analyze what is interesting to them, and oftentimes this period is not interesting to them. Again, for them, it's although certainly this period of time here after China is reunited in 589 um, is often seen as one of the great periods of Chinese history. Certainly one of the great, a number of great emperors. But still, the pattern is set here. And it's very similar. By the way, of course, since both sides, since the temperature is dropping on both sides, and since both China and Western Europe are having diseases at about the same time, I think there's enough of these coincidences to say that there's really some kind of shared that essentially trade and animals going back and forth, raiders, because certainly some places raided both China and Western Europe, that they carried disease with them. And so as a result, I think you could say, with some reason, that China and Western Europe are tied together by the aspect of disease and trade. Can't ignore trade. Without trade, you don't get diseases going back and forth, but still, the parallels are very strong. Western Europe, as I've said, closely parallels, with the exception of that one period where China coalesces again, and the Western Europe does not. But Western Europe is closely tied to China. Again, at least chronologically. We can argue over whether or not this is a coincidence or not, but there's just too many coincidences there. And certainly we know that trade between one place and another never stops. Just as an example, Turkey, we know, is tied to China. What is called the Silk Road, or what will be called the Silk Road, is already in existence at this point. And yet we find stuff from Turkey in England. And so it's pretty clear that even during the darkest part of the Dark Ages, when it was almost impossible to travel, trade and commerce did travel, and with it, of course, germs, rats, fleas, things like that. In Europe, the Dark Ages, certainly a period of microparasitism. And you get to pick your choice here, but starting at the bottom of this list here are the Saracens, which would be considered your Islamic raiders. They raid relentlessly through the southern part of Europe. The Saracens occupy Spain in 711, knocking off the Visigoths, by the way, or pushing them into a tiny section of northern Spain. Then the Magyars, who come in from the east, they're slavers, and they would enslave entire bodies of people and move them to a port where they could sell them. And they tended to drive their herds of humans along with long whips, and it was very brutal. Since as always, you could sell slaves for a great deal of money. If you bump off a number of the people you're herding along, so what? It's the cost of doing business. And so the Magyars and then the Vikings, probably almost certainly the most damaging, and the Viking raids that hit England and Ireland, France, clear up into Switzerland, and eventually around Spain and into Rome itself. So the Vikings are very active. They plunder and they burn and they steal and they feed themselves because it's getting cold, right? This is a cold period of time. Cold, wet period of time. The crops don't grow well. And certainly I think that makes that drives the Vikings, perhaps more than the Magyars or the Saracens. That drives the Vikings to raid, and raid they do, and raid very well. This is also a period of microparasitism. Now, we don't get a good look at what diseases that we are looking at. There's no question that the bubonic plague that so damaged the Byzantine Empire, that the bubonic plague also damaged, within a few years, travels into what used to be the Western Empire, into what is now France, into what is now England. No question that goes there, Spain. But Our records are too few. We only have a few good ones, and things are kind of, scratchy, kind of bits and pieces of stuff, and so we don't get a real good picture. I know that Roy McNeil in Plagues and People talks about there being over 80 waves of illness in England in this period of time, and then yeah, I think so, and particularly because you're being raided at the same time that these diseases are being are hitting, and so if the Vikings burn down your crops, you're much more susceptible to being contracting disease, and so that's what happened. The life expectancy drops. Certainly, we know from the few graves we have that like bones are thinner at this period of time. There's significant evidence of malnutrition, and with the exception of the period of Charlemagne from the late 700s and early 800s, you just don't really, there's just no real leadership, and there won't be until about 961, when the German Empire is founded by Otto the First. And so, you both China and Western Europe come back together, pull back together at the same time, almost the very same year. And so I think that, again, the parallels and I think the connecting tissue, again, is commerce, travel, and disease. And I think that's what ties these two groups together. So anyway, the Dark Ages were dark. And the fact that historians can find lots of great and interesting and new things that were happening there, well, we're specialists and we're good at finding these things. I think to the average person on the street, the Dark Ages really were dark. Your chances, if you just look at agricultural output, which we haven't talked about and your book doesn't talk about, even agricultural output in China and in Western Europe just declines. So starvation is common. Certainly violence is ever common. But if you go back and you look at the figures as such as we can work them out, the chances of being murdered were something like 13 times greater then than they are now. So this was a period in both China and in Western Europe. This is a period of time of really intense threat to life. India, I don't think changes very much, but the threat to life in India is always intense. And so now, what's about to happen is the weather's about to improve, and macroparasitism is going to decline, and microparasitism, the weather's better and you're getting more food, declines too, and some rather spectacular things occur. So everybody stay safe out there. Good health to all of you. And as I like to say, I hope we meet again sometime. Take care.